Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Meadows, Director for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services and the Administration for Children and Families. On behalf of the division, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on completing the FY24 Household Report short form version. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will focus on key items needed to complete the FY2024 Household Report, which is due in OLDC on December 31st, 2024. The purposes of the webinar are to review the key requirements for completing the short form version of the report, to explain changes made to the report for FY2024, to review the data you need to prepare for the report, and to review the process for submitting and updating the report. The audience for today's webinar are tribal and selected territory grant recipients that are required to submit the short form version of the report. LIHEAP staff and contractors who assist with completing the report are also welcome today. If you have staff unable to attend or you want to hear the training again, today's webinar will be recorded and then posted on the ACF YouTube channel. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is being conducted by APRISE. APRISE is a nonprofit research institute contracted with ACF to provide training and technical assistance for LIHEAP. APRISE has worked with tribal and territory grant recipients on reviewing and verifying the quarterly report and has also provided one-on-one support for performance management and reporting needs. We have two presenters from the APRISE team today, and in the spirit of Halloween, you will see the two counts that are joining our presentation today. Dan Bouch has worked on LIHEAP reporting and training for more than 10 years, and Melissa Torgerson is a former LIHEAP coordinator for the state of Oregon, and she works regularly to assist grant recipients with in-depth technical assistance. We greatly appreciate you joining us today, and we hope today's training will be valuable. With that, Melissa, please take it away.
All right, this count has to put on her glasses. I apologize. So the structure of the webinar today, we're going to be talking with you for 60 minutes. And all of the slides that we're going through, as well as the handouts that we're talking about, are currently available in your webinar sidebar. And you may not see it. You can expand it using an orange arrow. You should be able to see it then. This webinar is being recorded and it will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. And those handouts that we have included and that are available to you really include some key resources for helping you both understand this webinar as well as get through your reporting once the webinar is completed. Next slide. So if you have a question, we encourage you to type it in the question box of the GoToWebinar sidebar. And you can see a little picture here of what that looks like. Once again, if you're not seeing that sidebar, that full white rectangle, you'll want to click on the little orange arrow. That'll help you see both the handouts, the chat box, as well as the question box. And we'll go ahead and review your questions through the webinar. We'll respond to them at the end. And if we don't get to it, we will respond via email. This is kind of a table of contents or index for this webinar. And we're not going to go through each piece right now, but what this is kind of a resource for you as you go back through this webinar, or the slides, or you want to take something to someone on your team and talk with them about it. This gives you a nice little guide of what we're going to talk about today, and will help you skip right to the area you need to when you go back through it. With that, I want to kind of cap off this first section by reminding everyone that the household is due on December 31st. There was an estimated household report due in September. This included estimates, but this December one is your final. So this should have all of your real actual numbers in it. And it will cover all of the households that were served in this past federal fiscal year. Other reports, as you know, that are due are the model plan, which was due in September, the quarterly report, quarter fours of FY24 was due at the end of October. The carryover and reallotment report is also coming up, and that will be due in December. And the SF425, which is the federal financial report, we expect that to be due at the end of December as well. And so with that, I'm going to, I believe, pass it to, no, I'm not, I'm doing a poll, apologize. So let's start with this poll. How prepared do you think your team is for completing the final FY24 LIHEAP Household Report? Are you not at all prepared, so you haven't yet turned attention to this? Are you a little bit prepared, so you're aware of it, you're here today, but you haven't planned anything yet? You're mostly prepared, you're already thinking about this, maybe you're starting to look at the data, or you're very prepared, you're already working on it, you understand what you're doing.
I'll give it another few seconds.
Great. All right, so it looks like most of you are in these middle two categories. You're maybe a little prepared, you're where it's happening, or you're not planning it, or maybe you're just starting to get going on this. And some of you feel very prepared, and hopefully this webinar will help all of you take a little step closer or get more clarity in areas that you're unclear. And just keep in mind that this webinar is an hour long, but if some of you are new or maybe new to reporting, we have a lot of resources available after the webinar as well. You're always welcome to call us. You'll hear that a lot today. So if you can take a few things away from this webinar and then feel comfortable calling us to get any additional help you need, that's a good place to be. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dan Bausch at Apprise.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Just to make sure you can see everything during the rest of the webinar, we've shut our cameras off now, but hope you enjoyed the costumes for today. So we're going to start with an overview of what the Household Report short form is, and we want you to just understand why this form was developed and why it's important and useful. So the Household Report has been in existence since the 1980s as a report that is done and reported to HHS to understand the outcome of LIHEAP funds and how those funds are being used to assist eligible low-income households. There's two different versions of the report. So today we're talking about the short form. The short form is completed by tribal grant recipients and select smaller territory grant recipients. And the long form is completed by state grant recipients and select larger territories. Now with the short form, there are tribal grant recipients that were approved under Public Law 477 for LIHEAP integration beginning with FY24. And those grant recipients are not required to submit this report. If you are not sure if you may be one of them, we encourage you to contact your OCS program specialist. All other tribal grant recipients are required to submit this report. So what does this report ask for? There are two main types of information that the Household Report short form collects. The first is it's asking for the count of households that received each type of LIHEAP assistance in the prior fiscal year. That's heating assistance, cooling assistance, crisis assistance, weatherization, for example. Besides those counts, the second item it's asking for is demographic information on the characteristics of households and individuals that received LIHEAP assistance during that prior fiscal year. Those are the newest items that have been added to the report, and we're going to spend time later in the webinar talking about them. Okay, so why is this information collected by the federal LIHEAP office? Well, there's four main purposes that this information is used for. One is to track how many types of households are receiving the different types of LIHEAP assistance. That is something that has changed and evolved over the course of LIHEAP's history. So it's important to know how many households are getting heating compared to cooling, compared to crisis and weatherization. Second is the report helps document the characteristics of the households that are receiving the assistance. So demographic information, as well as other useful information about whether they own or rent or have another housing situation related to their housing costs and energy costs. Third, the information is used to provide information to the congressional staff members, White House inquiries, and public and stakeholder inquiries about LIHEAP. And then fourth, it is used to communicate information to the public about LIHEAP by HHS, as well as from each grant recipient individually can use this information to answer public questions or provide information. So as an example, for FY 2023 household reports, that's the reports you submitted this time last year, the tribal grant recipients provided more than 33,000 households with heating assistance based on those reports. So that information you submit can be combined with other tribal grant recipients to give a bigger picture of the amount of LIHEAP assistance that all tribal grant recipients are providing. And more broadly, we want you to know that the information in this report is useful and valuable for you and for your programs. This can provide a really important source of information to help you understand and characterize your programs, especially over time with different circumstances on the ground and different funding levels. And it can also give you insights to help you make program changes and choices over time each year to meet your goals and to better serve households that are in need of assistance. Okay, so we're going to talk about the different reports that you're asked to submit each year to the Federal LIHEAP office and how they all relate to one another. So the starting point is the LIHEAP model plan. This is due each September. You just submitted it for federal fiscal year 2025. And the plan provides a picture of what you're intending to do in the coming federal fiscal year with your LIHEAP funds, the components you'll offer, the benefit levels you plan to provide, your eligibility criteria, and other useful information. You need input on that plan each year, and that acts as your blueprint for what your programs will look like. Then during the fiscal year, you have to submit reports to the Federal LIHEAP office as well. The quarterly LIHEAP report is submitted every 3 months, and that report is intended to give a snapshot that's close to real time of what each program is doing with their LIHEAP funds, any technical assistance challenges, any program changes you're making because of new circumstances. So that report gives that real-time information, and the information you report is put into a public LIHEAP data dashboard that you can access through the Federal LIHEAP ACF website. Then as you wrap up your programs and the federal fiscal year ends, you have to report information back to the Federal LIHEAP office related to your obligation of funds that were available and related to the households that you assisted in the report we're talking about today, the household report. So the carryover report and the SF425, the federal financial report, that gives the Federal LIHEAP office information about how much you've obligated, how much you're carrying over, if any funds were not able to be obligated and need to be returned. But the household report provides the picture of where the funds were used to provide assistance and how many households benefited from your programs. Okay, so we're going to talk about what's new for the household report short form for 2024. That's the current report. Okay, so first, in late August, the Federal LIHEAP Office the Office of Community Services that houses the Federal LIHEAP staff, they published a communication called an action transmittal that had information about the household report short form, including the instructions and including a document that showed what the report looks like. If you didn't see that, if you look in the handouts on the side of your screen now in the GoToWebinar platform, there are copies of those documents you can download and use and have. In the action transmittal, it stated that for the household report for 2024, a preliminary report was going to be due. That was announced, and HHS communicated that as well through emails. That was due in September. That's just an initial estimated report, and the information doesn't have to be final or accurate, and it's not used or published in any way. The final report that has to use your actual numbers that you've calculated, that's due at the end of December. And so that's the focus of our webinar today, is completing that report using the information you have in your records on who was assisted. This report is due in the OLDC system where you submit your quarterly reports. That's accessed through Grant Solutions is the name of the company, the platform. And you need credentials to get into OLDC, and you need to also be able to have the correct individual who can certify the report to submit it. If you are not sure about this sounds like something you're not familiar with or haven't heard of, we encourage you to reach out to your program specialist or your regional liaison to ask about this information. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about this report and what's changed from last year's report for 2023. So the good news is there are not any changes to the report layout, the lines in the report, or how the report looks. It looks the same as last year. It's asking for the same information as last year, but there is one change we wanted to reiterate and that we're going to highlight for you today. That is that for last year's 2023 report, there were new sections added to collect demographic information. Several of those sections were required, and some of those sections were optional for last year's report for 2023. But at the time that those were added, the Federal LIHEAP Office announced that the optional sections were optional for 1 year, and then were going to become required for FY24 for the report that's due in December. So those sections that were optional last year, 2 sections, have now been made required and mandatory for the 2024 report. So it is expected that you work to complete those sections, and we're going to show you them and talk about them and talk about what to do if you don't have the complete information for those sections. We want you to know there's a lot of resources that are available to assist you with the report. We don't want anyone trying to just figure it out from scratch. So some of these are included in the handouts of this webinar, and some of them we can also provide to you if you're having trouble accessing them. The first is the template for the report is included as a handout, as a document here. We also have a spreadsheet version of it if you would like that. We have a document called Check Before You Submit. That's a checklist you can go through to make sure you have everything you need before you put the report into OLDC and hit the submit button. That is in the handouts. OLDC can be challenging if you haven't used it before, you don't use it regularly. There is a guide that we have that can also help with that. And then lastly, we do offer personalized support from our staff at Apprise, and we have contact information at the end of this webinar. We are here to be able to help you and to assist you with questions you have before the report is due. So if you need that, please reach out. Okay, now we're going to talk about the data that's needed to complete the report. And I'll turn it to Melissa.
Thanks, Dan. So we're going to go through each data element that you should have for the households that you assisted in federal fiscal year 2024. So to start, you're going to need the type of assistance each household was provided. This might include heating, cooling, weatherization, or equipment repair and replacement. The next you're going to need is the type of funds used. For many of you, this will be just your base LIHEAP grant, but some of you also had CARES or ARPA money remaining. And so if the benefit you issued to a household contained CARES or ARPA funding, you're going to want to have that noted. The next are the demographics of the primary applicant. So this is the person who applied, turned in the application. Some of you call them the head of household. And for this, you're going to want to know their race, ethnicity, and gender. Next, as Dan mentioned, there are some new elements this year. So now, in addition to the applicant or head of household, you're also required to collect this information, this demographic information for household members. So spouses, children, grandparents, anyone else who is in the LIHEAP household. And this is also race, ethnicity, and gender. And also now required is the housing tenure of the primary applicant. So this is related to whether they own or rent their home and whether or not utility costs are included in rent. And we're going to cover both of these in more detail so you see the exact question that's on the form. So the report asks for the number of assisted households across different assistance categories. And so to calculate these, you need to have a data set or a spreadsheet with information on each household that was assisted in FY24. And this is October 1st of 2023 to September 30th of 2024. And for each item in the short form, I need to identify which of those households in the data set are relevant. Then you'll need to count up or sum the total number of those cases you identified and assure you're counting correctly. For most items in the short form, you're counting assisted households. So let's take a quick look at an example. This is what an example spreadsheet might look like. And for some people, many people will do a line for each benefit. The ID column this is their household or individual ID, depending on how you track it. And so what you might see in a longer spreadsheet is that ID number on the first line, the 2034 number, that might be repeated, for example, if they were to get a summer benefit or a equipment benefit or a crisis benefit. And the way that you count that household only once is by having a unique number assigned to either each household or applicant. You're going to see that there's a name there. We've blacked that out. Benefit type received, heating, winter crisis. This also might be cooling, summer crisis, or summer crisis. Equipment repair or replacement. It could be weatherization as well. Benefit award date. This is going to help you track which report it should be in. For some of you, you don't run on the same time frame as the federal fiscal year. And so what we'll talk about later is that regardless of when your program year is in your tribe or territory, you are not you're only going to be reporting on those that fall within that federal fiscal year time period. And so this benefit award date will help you pull those folks out that maybe belong in the next year's reporting or the prior year's reporting. Funds used for the benefit, here we have all regular, but if ARPA or CARES were used for the benefit, this is where you would put that. Tenure, this is what we were talking about, owning and renting and whether or not utilities are included. This is where you would track that. The primary applicant, this is if you're tracking by individuals, we're going to pretend that this spreadsheet could be two things. If each of these folks were individuals, for example, which I think the first three might be, perhaps they're the same household, but you've got applicant on the first line, which is why that says yes. And then 35 and 36 are actually maybe a spouse and a child. And so in this case, this is tracking each individual, and the primary applicant would be no in these categories. Race, once again, you have race for each individual and ethnicity as well. So Dan will mention later, and I'll mention as well, many of you have a plethora of different ways that you're tracking. You might be tracking by individual like we just saw. You might be just tracking by household or head of household. Some of you might be using Post-it notes. So we know that there's a range of different ways you're tracking information, but this is one example of the kind of information you should be tracking on the people who are coming through your program. Okay, next slide. So some key reporting points for accurate reporting. For the household report, you're going to be reporting on how many households received assistance. And this includes households that were issued a benefit that was paid with federal LIHEAP funds, or households who received equipment or weatherization paid with federal LIHEAP funds. You should not be including households that were served entirely with other funds besides LIHEAP, households who applied but were denied assistance or did not receive a benefit, and households who applied but were not assisted until after the beginning of federal fiscal year, or I'm sorry, the end of fiscal year 24. So let's take a look at the next slide here. We're only going to report for those assisted during FY24. So this was from October 1st, 2023 to September 30th, 2024. And even if your program is operating on a different period, the report is for this period only, which is why that date is really critical in your data. Some examples: household A received a heating benefit on November 5th, 2023. This was within the reporting period, so we're going to include that household. But household B applied early in the season on September 25th, 2024, but wasn't issued a benefit, or the intake didn't occur, they weren't approved for a benefit until October 5th, 2024. These would not be included in the report because they fall outside of that federal fiscal year 24 timeline that's noted above. So dates are going to be really important. And if you have questions about that whole apply versus intake versus paid and where things fall, give us a call and we'll help talk you through that. We only want to report each household once per line. This is a really important point and one that can get a little confusing. This is what we call unique households, or sometimes we call this an unduplicated account. In each line of sections 1 through 4, we're asking for the number of unique households served for that category. So if your program allows you to provide the same type of assistance to households more than once per year, you're going to need to count those households only once per line, even if they got 2 benefits. It's correct to report the same household on multiple lines in the report because different lines ask about different items. For example, if household C received both heating and crisis assistance, you're going to include them in the counts for heating assistance and in the crisis assistance line. Let's take a look at the next slide. We like to look at, sometimes we find it helpful to look at dots and colors, or the concept of dots and colors, when we talk about unduplicated counts. And here we've assigned household 1 a blue dot, household 2 a green dot, and household 3 a red dot. Now, if you pay attention to household 1, they received a heating benefit in November 2023 and a second heating benefit in March 2024. So when we look at the number of benefits, you can see they're counted twice, and there's 4 benefits total. But when we get to counting households for this report, we only want to count the number of households, which means we're not counting the number of dots, we're counting the number of colors. So you're going to see blue only counted once over in the household report line because it's 1 household. And then you'll see, of course, the green and red dots as well. So we gave 4 benefits, but only 3 households received them. And it's that household count that we're looking for in each of these lines. So now we'll talk about section 1, types of assistance.
Okay. This is what the report looks like when you go to it in OLDC. Now it looks overwhelming when you're first looking at it, but we don't want you to feel overwhelmed or scared about it. There's a lot of lines because the report was expanded when there was additional supplemental funding. But many of these lines now you will not need to fill in. And most of you will probably have to fill in 3 or 4 of these lines. So we're gonna go into detail about how each of these lines differs. So there are 6 different categories that exist in the household report for you to report counts of households like Melissa just discussed. And those are based on different types of assistance. You may use these names for your own program, but you may not use these names, and you have to kind of identify how your component, which of these categories your assistance will best go under. So the categories are heating assistance. That's normally assistance during the winter for main heating equipment like furnace, to pay for the fuel for your furnace, or fuel for a boiler, or for wood, or to maintain electricity for heating. Cooling assistance is normally assistance in the hotter months to maintain cooling equipment. Crisis assistance, winter or year-round, that's emergency assistance for someone facing a crisis situation. Summer crisis, same thing during the warmer months. Weatherization, that's LIHEAP weatherization, where you can use a portion of your LIHEAP funds towards home improvements designed to reduce energy usage. And then lastly, other crisis assistance that might be separate from your standard bill crisis assistance to help people facing bill assistance issues like shutoffs or disconnections. All households that got assistance during 2024 should be reported if they received federal LIHEAP dollars to help provide that benefit in the report. We talked about the other crisis assistance, but if you're not sure how to report in these categories, one place to first look is to go back to your model plan and see which types of assistance you reported and where you reported them under heating, cooling, winter crisis, summer crisis, etc. If you're still struggling to understand maybe where to put something, where the best location is, we encourage you to reach out to your program specialist or to us. Okay, so within each of those categories, you'll see that the report has multiple lines. If you actually go back, Nicholas, to the picture from the, yeah, so heating here, there's 4 lines, cooling, there's 4 lines, winter, there's 4. Each type has 4 lines in the report right now. So if you go back to the slide, Nicholas. Each of these 4 lines is different, but many of them you are only going to have to fill out 1 line. The first line is any households that got that type of assistance. So if you gave assistance to a household for a heating need, a regular benefit, let's say you gave 20 households that benefit, on this first line you would report 20 households for heating assistance. The second and third line are special lines that were added when there were additional funds for LIHEAP during the pandemic, the CARES Act funds, and the American Rescue Plan Act funds. Those lines, you only need to report households if you still are using dollars, using funds available from CARES or ARPA that you received several years ago, if you're still using some remaining funds to assist households. For most of you, those lines will not be applicable, but for some of you, you may have remaining funds that you're still expending to help households. And the idea is the first line is everybody that got the assistance. And then the second and third lines are filtered down to the subset of households that got that assistance with those supplemental dollars. The fourth line is not applicable at all for 2024, and you will not be able to enter anything in that line in OLDC. So the fourth line, you do not have to worry about for this report. So the key takeaway, if you click Nicholas, is that all grant recipients have to fill in the first line if you provided that type of assistance. Nobody has to fill in the fourth line. And the second and third lines, just you may have to fill in if you still are using CARES Act funds or ARPA funds from 2020 and 2021. Okay. Now we're going to look at sections 2 to section 6, which are the demographic sections that we talked a little bit about earlier. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, those sections were added last year for the 2023 report, and they ask for demographic information. They were added by the Federal LIHEAP Office to get a better understanding of the types of households and the types of individuals that are receiving LIHEAP assistance. Some of those sections were optional for the 2023 report, but they are now required for the 2024 report. Now, there's lots of ways that you may be collecting demographic information. There's different categories that you may use from the categories that are in this report, and that is acceptable and that's fine. The report has, as we're going to see in the next slides, other category and an unknown not reported category that can help if your categories don't quite match, or if you don't have this information for some households. There's still a spot in the report to report those counts. So we're going to start with section 2, which is the own rent status. This was optional but is now required, and you can see it on the bottom of the slide here. There's different categories of whether the household that was assisted owns their home, rents their home, or has another situation that's neither owning nor renting their home, as well as unknown not reported if they didn't provide that information or if it's not available. What we want to reiterate here is that this also is meant to be a count of households. So if a household got heating and then later got cooling assistance, you would still want to count them only once as you're reporting these numbers here. In general, if you see a conflict in your information, like an earlier benefit they mentioned renting, but a later benefit, they mentioned owning, we recommend you just have a process where you use the earliest record for that household to report. And then if you look at the last bullet here, you'll notice that item number 3 in the table, it says rent with utilities in rental fee. That category is meant for you to report if a household has either their heat or their electricity included in their rent. They don't receive a separate bill for heat or electricity. You would try to report those on line 3. Again, if you have households you don't have this information, line 5 is where they can be reported. And if you look at the very bottom of the table, there's a total field. That's going to automatically add up based on what you put in the lines above it. So you don't need to fill in that total column. That will auto fill once you enter the information and go to validate your report in OLDC. Next slide. Okay, the next demographic item that the report is asking for is the ethnicity of the primary applicant. And that's in section A of part A of section 3. For this, you can see there's 2 categories. Again, this is just a count for the primary applicant. So that means if you have a household of 6 people, you should be reporting for just the primary applicant in that household. So 1 out of the 6 people, you would be reporting their ethnicity here. These categories, if you're not sure or you don't have this for everyone, you have the unknown category, and the report has a notes section at the end where you can note anything that you want to communicate or explain. If there's any challenges, we encourage people to also list that so it's recorded in your report. Okay, the next part of this section is B, race, and this is where you're going to report on the race of the primary applicant. This should be based on what is self-reported by the applicant, usually in their application. So when you record this information, you can see there's 7 different categories. There is an option 6, if the primary applicant selects 2 or more races, that you can count them on line 6. And we want to just remind you, for all of these demographic items, none of this is information that a household has to report to receive LIHEAP assistance. This is all information that households households can report, but they may also choose not to report this information. That's okay. For the household report, the Federal LIHEAP office is requiring you to fill in this section and provide the information you have. It's not saying anything about households needing to furnish this information. So we just wanted to make it clear that you may have households that didn't report it, and that's fine. Okay, section 4 is collecting information on the gender of the primary applicant. This is like the other sections I just went through, where it's focused on the primary applicant. And there is an other category, there's an unknown not reported category. And again, with all of this, where this information should be reported by the primary applicant themselves and documented through the application process. Okay. When we get to section 5, this was a section that was optional last year and is now required for the 2024 report. This looks just like the earlier section, collecting ethnicity and race information. The only difference is this section should be for all household members. So going back to my example of a household with 6, in the earlier section, you're just reporting the race and ethnicity of one of those 6 members, one of the 6 people in the household, the primary applicant. Now, when you get to section 5, you should be reporting the information you have for all 6 individuals in the household. And so to do that, you need to be collecting information when a household comes for assistance, collecting information on each household member. You may not be fully doing that now, maybe in the process of working on it. And that's okay. There's the unknown not reported lines to report that, and you can also indicate that in the notes. The same is true as well for section 6. This looks like the earlier section for the gender of the primary applicant, but now it's for all household members. So with this and the prior section on section 5, your numbers should be higher than in the earlier sections because we're moving from primary applicant to all household members. We know that these are new. The Federal LIHEAP office knows that these are new sections. And so we're encouraging you to do the best you can with the information you have. And there may be a need for improvements over time. That's okay. But if you have questions, if you look at the instructions or you're going back in a month to work on the report and you're not sure of something, we want you to reach out to us so we can help you. All right, now we're going to turn to some final reminders and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'll turn it back to Melissa.
Thanks, Dan. So just a reminder that the final report is due in OLDC on December 31st. And unlike the preliminary report that many of you submitted in September, this should include non-estimated data. So it needs to be final data that's taken from your tracking system or your program records. If you need technical assistance, as we've mentioned throughout this webinar, please contact as soon as possible. Don't wait until the report's due. We've helped a lot of folks over the past many years, and so chances are the issue that you're facing is something we've helped someone else with and can give you some advice to work through whatever issues you might be facing. Next slide. So the good news is that there are no changes to the report lines or layout for this year's reports when you compare it to last year. The change is that we have new sections to collect demographic data. Last year, the demographic data for the primary applicant or head of household was required. But this year you're going to have to report on all household members, and whether the household owned or rented was also optional in FY23, and now you'll need to report that here in FY24. Now this was reviewed, so some of you have had a chance to prepare and ramp up and get ready, but some of you still may be working on that. And so as Dan mentioned, you know, if you're not quite there, if you need assistance, or if you just need to note it in your report that, you know, we've been able to do this for some of our households, but we're still working on collecting this information for all of them. All of that can be noted in the report, and we understand that. So OLDC, as Dan mentioned, can be time consuming, especially if you're not in there regularly or if you're new to the system. And to complete this reporting requirement, it must be submitted in OLDC. We've included a login URL here. We've also given you a phone number and the help desk. If you are contacting them and not hearing anything, please reach out to us and we will try to help you get through to them from our end as well. Just a reminder, when you are going through this process, it is kind of a multi-step process. And so there are roles. You'll want to make sure your roles are set and that whoever's entering has the role of grant administrator so that they can do all the different steps. Because first you need to enter and save your report. You'll then need to validate it. Once the form is valid and correct, you'll need to certify and submit it. And so the grant administrator has permissions to do all of those particular roles. So make sure that when you go to submit your report, the right person with the right permissions is doing so. There are validation checks when you submit your report in OLDC, and basically this just scans what you've submitted and says, does anything look wrong or potentially wrong? The warning messages come when there's something that is potentially wrong. So maybe it's a number that looks very different than what you submitted in the prior year, or when compared with other data, it doesn't quite look right. And so a warning will just kind of alert you to it. It'll kind of force you to take another look at it. And what we recommend is that if you look at it and you say, no, this is right, I've checked it, I know it's right, we encourage you to put a note in the notes section that says, you know, field XYZ, whatever it might be, is correct. We've double checked it. And the reason for this is that after the system does validations, Apprise staff does the validations on their end. And so they may see or have questions, but if you've already addressed them in your notes section, they can just move on. The fatal error messages will not let you submit. So if you get a fatal error message, it means something must be fixed. Either it's mathematically impossible, or it's clearly wrong, clearly erroneous. And so if you get this kind of warning, you won't be able to move on. You'll need to fix it. Now, if you get either a warning or an error message that either you're not clear about, you don't quite understand what it's saying, or that you're like, no, I know this is right, and you can't get past it, please contact us and we will help you work through that, or tell you what you need to enter in order to get through and to post the report. We have had instances of some outdated validation checks being triggered, and so if there's an incorrect check that comes up and you can see it's incorrect, please give us a call so that we can get that fixed for everyone. We have some resources that Dan talked about at the beginning of the webinar, and we just want to bring your attention to them again. The first is the Household Report AT and instructions. This is the official guidance from OCS on this report, as well as a check before you submit document, which helps you go through and make sure you have everything done correctly and filled out before you go to put it into OLDC. Next slide. So we have some final reminders about upcoming training webinars. Dan mentioned that you all also complete the carryover and reallotment report, as well as the federal financial report, and webinar for those reports will be held on November 14th. And then all of you also complete quarterly reports. And so we'll be doing a refresher on completing quarterly reports, and that will take place on December 17th. And so be watching your emails for registration links coming soon. And finally, this is all of our contact information. It includes your OCS liaisons, as well as a list of state and territory and tribal contact listings, so that if you'd like to talk to your peers as you're going through this process, you can reach out and talk to them. Our entire team is listed here. You can contact any of us, and if we don't have the answers, we'll put you in contact with someone who does. So please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions about your reporting cycle or any of these reports. And I think we're going to end with a poll. And so what we're hoping to find out from you is, how helpful was this webinar in understanding what is needed to complete the FY24 Household Report short form? Was it not at all helpful, not too helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful?
We are going to take questions right after the poll. So if you have a question, you want to type it in, or yeah, if you want to type it in, let us know and we'll address it.
All right, I'll give it another 15 seconds.
All right, it looked like the webinar was pretty helpful for most of you, and for some of you it was somewhat helpful. And what we hope is that if there are still areas that are unclear, that you'll go back and revisit the webinar or give us a call directly and we can give you some one-on-one guidance. We are genuinely happy to do that. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything you need. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to take questions now, so I'll turn it over to Dan and Nicholas.
Thanks, Melissa. So our first question asks, why are the demographic sections required? I received some pushback from the community I serve when it comes to collecting gender information.
Yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate you sharing that with us. So I think the reason the demographics were added in 2023 was for LIHEAP as a program to have better information on the households and the individuals that were being assisted, and to be able to put that information to use in the future to report on how LIHEAP is impacting different households. Yeah, there can be different feelings about the information being collected. So one thing we want to emphasize is you always want to make sure that clients aren't forced to provide it if they're not comfortable doing that. Of course, they're not required that they have to fill in those items. I would also encourage you, if you have that kind of feedback, to share it with your program specialists so that they know as well. And then if you have questions about like how best to include this on your application or where to include it, that could also be something that's useful to look at and to think about maybe changing how it's being asked or where it's being asked. So you could contact us or Melissa, and there's lots of grant recipients that have collected this for a long time in different forms and may also have had similar experiences and learned from them.
All right, so our next question asks, can we turn in the report before the due date?
Yeah, so the report is available now in OLDC, and the same report that you submitted in September, the preliminary report, if you submitted that, what you would do is go in when you're ready and you have your final data, you can go in and edit that report to submit a final version of it. So there's an earlier slide in the webinar that shows you where in OLDC to navigate to, but it is available now and you can submit it before the due date. Other questions?
So our next question is, if they self-identify as Native but aren't tribally enrolled, do we still count them as Native?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yes, the answer would be yes. It should be based on identification, self-identification of individuals, and that category on the race sections is not based on tribal membership in particular.
And another question asks, so supplemental payments made after September 30th, 2024 would not be added to the report, correct?
Correct. So this, for the 2024 report, it's just asking you to report households assisted during federal fiscal year 2024, and that just ended the end of September. So anybody assisted in October this month would not be counted on the report.
I just want to point out, because we often get this question, some of you may provide a notice of action, approve a payment, provide a notice to the client that they are getting a benefit, and even make a pledge to the utility prior to October or September 30th, but not pay a utility for, say, 90 days. And so at that point, it is your choice whether you want to, which year you want to count them in. Because for some people, if you've already made a pledge, you've done the notice of action, you've essentially given them their benefit, you just haven't made the back end payment. So if that's you and you need help figuring out where those households should be counted, give us a call. But a supplemental payment, a kind of blanket supplemental payment made after September 30th would generally be counted in the next fiscal year.
Yeah, that's good clarification.
If we have time for one more question. So one attendee has asked, if we used our extra funds to buy heaters, the households we give them to, are those households we assisted?
Yep. Yeah. So if you assisted them with a benefit to pay for their bills or equipment. You use LIHEAP dollars to buy heating equipment or cooling equipment and provided it to households. You would count them on the report. They probably, it depends where they would go, but sometimes they might go under other crisis if it was a special crisis program. But it depends kind of where you categorize them, that assistance in the model plan. Well, we really appreciate all the questions and thank you for your time today. It looks like we're at time now. Any final words, Melissa?
No, just thanks for joining us. And once again, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, we appreciate your time and hope you have a good rest of your day.